Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by our friends at Mack Weldon, the premium men's essentials brand that believes in smart design and premium fabrics. Their design, Mack Weldon, is to be the most comfortable underwear or socks or shirts or hoodies or undershirts or sweatpants, you get the idea, and more that you'll ever wear. And our listeners this week, of course, can get 20% off their first order by visiting MackWeldon.com and entering the promo code GOODSEATS. Yes, 20% off your first order at MackWeldon.com. Enter that promo code GOODSEATS. Here's our show.
The Big O, Oscar Robertson, is recognized as perhaps the greatest sports figure ever to come out of Indianapolis. But 100 years ago, Indianapolis produced another spectacular athlete named Oscar, considered by those who saw or played with or against him, perhaps the greatest all-around baseball player that game has ever seen. Only a few folks had that honor. The rest of us are only now learning about the great Oscar Charleston. Because of his awesome power and barrel-chested physique, many called him the Black Babe Ruth. Because of his hitting, speed, and take-no-prisoners approach running the bases, many called him the Black Ty Cobb, to which his fans can only point out, excuse me, Babe Ruth or Ty Cobb was the white Oscar Charleston.
Good hitter, good hitter, good hitter. The fans was tickled to death when he came to bat.
Charleston was one of the greatest ball players that ever lived.
Indianapolis' Bill Owens and Chicago's Bobby Robinson are both in their 90s, but the years have not dimmed their memories of playing with or against Oscar Charleston in the Negro Leagues. Owens is an all-purpose infielder. Robinson is a slick-fielding third baseman, recalling a player who did everything memorably.
Greatest fielder you ever seen. Yeah, he could look like know where the ball was going. He'd go right to that spot and turn around and catch the ball.
He could do it all. He could hit, run, field, and throw.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get to it. How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this is, of course, Good Seats Still Available. Yep, it's our curious little podcast, our little journey, our little exploration each and every week, if you can believe it, into what used to be in professional sports. Thank you tremendously for finding us and putting us in your earbuds this week. We know you've got a quadrillion amount of choices out there in podcast land, and despite all the odds and all the consternation, we continue to put out a show each and every week on what we like to fascinate and obsess about, which is teams and leagues and the various stories no longer with us for whatever reasons. And we're going to continue our journey into the Negro Leagues this week with our guest, Jeremy Beer. And I know a number of you out there, look at sort of old baseball stuff as not as exciting, say, as the travails of, the Alliance of American Football from 6 months ago, or maybe the XFL in a couple of months, knock on wood, as it gets ready to attempt a life as well. But we continue to be fascinated by stories, regardless of how old they are, because if they're a team or a league or plurals of such, that are no longer with us. It's all part of the big tableau of pro sports. And this week's conversation is truly a standout one, and one that I learned a tremendous amount about, and not only in our conversation, but in this book that Jeremy Beer has written. It's called Oscar Charleston, The Life and Legend of Baseball's Greatest Forgotten Player. And, for those, even baseball scholars, I think it's lost upon them as the talent and the standout nature of this player known as Oscar Charleston, arguably, not even arguably, perhaps the best player in Negro League history. Now, a name, though, that most people, even historians, baseball historians, don't really know a whole lot about. I think even in the realm of Negro League history, right? People know Cool Papa Bell and certainly, folks like Satchel Paige, right? Those are names that even the cursory sports fan, just knows from legend and all those other things. But you get into it, as you'll hear in our conversation with Jeremy Beer in a few moments, those in the know and arguably not as well publicized would strongly suggest a guy like Oscar Charleston was the preeminent player, center fielder, and a slugger extraordinaire. And frankly, in the realm of this conversation and our little sojourn every week into teams and leagues no longer with us, a really good, frankly, excuse and example of just the very compelling and interesting and somewhat zigzag nature of what it was to be a player and a manager and a team in the Negro Leagues. Oscar Charleston, besides being a standout player and then ultimately a manager and a scout, and we'll get into some of that stuff in our conversation in a few moments, was on a ton of teams, right? Teams like the Indianapolis ABCs, a very well-regarded and longstanding team in the Negro Leagues. The Harrisburg Giants, for sure. And, of course, the Pittsburgh Crawfords, who in the 1930s were, among, especially that 1935 team, regarded as arguably the best team ever in the Negro Leagues. We're talking about teams like the Philadelphia Stars and the St. Louis Giants and the Chicago American Giants and the Hilldale Club. These are all, and in leagues, not only the Negro National Leagues, two of them, the Negro American League, the East-West All-Star Game, which was the showcase for African-American ball player talent in Chicago for many years, the Eastern Colored League. I mean, there's all kinds of variations and things, and all of these are, for us, check boxes of clubs and leagues no longer with us that are absolutely and endlessly fascinating. And the history and life of this amazing ball player by the name of Oscar Charleston. That's our conversation this week with Jeremy Beer. And I will tell you, not only is this conversation interesting and fascinating, but the book that Jeremy has written is well worth the deep dive. And frankly, as they proverbially say, makes a great gift. Not only is it well researched, but it's a very interesting read. And if you're looking, frankly, for a quintessential example of what Negro League baseball was all about, in the personification of one of its best players, you could do worse than to get a copy of this book, Oscar Charleston: The Life and Legend of Baseball's Greatest Forgotten Player. It is published by our friends at University of Nebraska Press. I highly recommend it. And I learned a whole bunch. And I think even to the cursory interest of folks just generally interested in baseball or just, African-American sports history, it's a fascinating a book and well worth pursuing. And of course, we'll have a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. But I highly recommend it. And read it first and listen to this episode, or vice versa. But I cannot strongly recommend it enough for your consideration. And we'll get to that conversation in just a moment as we roll on here. And we, of course, want to say hello and welcome again to one of our great sponsors. And that's, of course, in this week's episode, Dollar Shave Club. And you've heard me talk about them before. They are not just how to help you shave better and stay comfortable, but they've got you covered. Dollar Shave Club does, from literally head to toe. They've got everything that you need to shower, shave, style your hair, brush your teeth. Yeah, even wipe your back end there. It's a whole range of stuff to keep you fresh and clean and well shaved, shall we say. And it also is it's a great service, Dollar Shave Club is, to keep you automatically stocked up on all those products that you use without having to worry about going to the store and worrying, frankly, about the quality that you're getting. And of course, as the holidays get closer, if you're looking for that last-minute gift for that guy in your life, perhaps even for yourself, for God's sakes, you could put the quality of Dollar Shave Club's product to the test right now by getting their Ultimate Shave Starter Set, which basically has everything that you need for an amazing shave. Things like the Executive Razor, the Shave Butter, the Prep Scrub, and of course, that post-shave dew from Dollar Shave Club. It's all in that Ultimate Shave Starter Set. And the best part is, of course, you can try it for just $5. Our audience, our listeners, can get that Ultimate Starter Set for just $5 at dollarshaveclub.com/goodseats. That's again, dollarshaveclub.com/goodseats. And you will get for $5 only that Ultimate Shave Starter Set. And of course, after that, you get to be able to restock all of the stuff with their regular size products at their regular prices. But of course, you can choose as to how often or when you want to get restocked. If it takes you a long time to restock, well, so be it. If you shave a lot and like their stuff and want it on a weekly basis or then some, by all means, go ahead. But again, that's dollarshaveclub.com/goodseats for your $5 offer to get that Ultimate Shave Starter Set from Dollar Shave Club. Again, one more time, dollarshaveclub.com/goodseats and get your Ultimate Shave Starter Set for just $5. And we appreciate our pals at Dollar Shave Club for sponsoring this week's episode. And we appreciate you giving it a try and giving us a little love when you do so. And once you're done doing that, once you head on over to your earbuds and download and listen to, hopefully with some interesting, some knowledge coming your way, with our conversation coming right up here with Jeremy Beer as we talk about the life and the legacy of perhaps one of the Negro Leagues' greatest players, Oscar Charleston. Here's our chat coming right at you. Maybe give us, our audience, a sense of who you are and sort of how you came across the Oscar Charleston story. And I gotta think it's somewhat wrapped up in the Negro Leagues generally and or baseball interest overall, no?
Right. It's more the latter. Oscar led me to the Negro Leagues more generally. I'm just a baseball fan, not a journalist. I have a doctorate in psychology, actually, and so I'm sort of a frustrated academic who's working in consulting now, and really just a baseball fan and a Bill James fan, and was reading his new Bill James historical abstract 10 years ago or so, and going through his top 100 players of all time list. And it's the first time he had included Negro Leagues players in that list. He hadn't in the first edition of the book, but this is the second edition, because he thought he had more numbers to go on now, more information. And number 1 was Babe Ruth, which is totally understandable. Number 2 was Honus Wagner, fine. Number 3 was Willie Mays, pretty conventional so far. And number 4 was Oscar Charleston. And it blew my mind that it could possibly be the case that one of the top 5 players of all time could be somebody I'd never heard of. And I thought I was a baseball fan. I thought I knew something about the game's history. So that really just surprised me. And then I found out he's from Indiana, as I am, and that really piqued my interest. I thought my friends and I, would always going back and forth about the greatest, baseball players of all time from Indiana, greatest basketball players, greatest musicians, whatever. It's just like Indiana stuff. And he was not on any of our radar screens. So that really piqued my interest, really kind of ticked me off that there was somebody like that who could escape my historical consciousness. So that is how I got interested in Charleston, which led me to do a deep dive into the Negro Leagues and African-American history in the 20th century a little bit as well, and led to the book.
So that's interesting. So Robert Peterson, right, who wrote, one of the more seminal works, Only the Ball Was White, I quote from his book, and this is sort of leads me to my next question. At his peak, Charleston was perhaps the most popular player in the game. When he was with Hilldale in 1928 to 29, he was to Philadelphia what Smokey Joe Williams was to New Yorkers when the latter was with the Lincoln Giants, their hero, wrote Chester L. Washington in the Pittsburgh Courier. Quote, scores of school kids turned out regularly just to see Oscar perform. He was to them what Babe Ruth is to kids of a lighter hue. And it leads me to sort of the general question, and I think you kind of sort of stumbled across it a little bit in your answer. Random people who have a passing understanding of baseball and a little bit of history, right, know people like Satchel Paige and arguably Cool Papa Bell, right? But Oscar Charleston, right, despite being so highly ranked by somebody like a Bill James, right? And so to those in the know, well regarded and or lauded, frankly, for his talents, and we'll get into a bunch of it. How come his name and his persona is arguably lesser known than some of those other names?
Yeah, not arguably. I mean, definitely, definitely lesser known. It's there are a lot of facets to that answer. Paige, first of all, played in the major leagues and lived on to see himself be inducted into the Hall of Fame, and was a quote machine and a total character. Paige had this sort of dynamic, once in a generation personality that is just unforgettable, right? So he's in a category of his own. Bell had the good luck to be talked about by Paige. He figures in Satchel Paige anecdotes. That's primarily, I think, how he sort of came into our view. He's also blessed with a great nickname, and he lived for quite a while after his career, and also had family members who tended his flame. Charleston didn't have any of that luck. He died young in 1954. He wasn't a self-promoter while he was alive. He did not leave any descendants, no children, and no one. He was separated from his wife, and she was a quiet person. There was no one tending his flame. And his city didn't claim him. Indianapolis didn't sort of hold him up as a favorite son. I think Indianapolis had sort of forgotten about him by the time he died. And then you have this period really from the 50s through the 70s, really until Robert Peterson writes Only the Ball Was White, where no historians or researchers really seemed to do much with the Negro Leagues. There wasn't a lot of incentive in the white community or the black community for remembering the Negro Leagues. It was sort of a painful memory. And so you have this period where there's sort of not much done. And by the time we get past that period, Charleston's gone. Most of the men who saw him play in his prime were gone, and weren't family members to talk to. And so I think it's all those things. One more thing I would add, he's not the only one, right? Among players who played their entire careers in the Negro Leagues, we know kind of generally the random person, like you said, who's interested in sports, knows about Josh Gibson to some extent. They might know the name Cool Papa Bell, but they don't know anybody else from the Negro Leagues. They don't know John Donaldson or Bullet Rogan or John Henry Lloyd or Cristobal Torriente. None of these guys. So Charleston, in a way, should stand for us as sort of like a representative of this entire field, still open to us to get to know.
So how did he stand out on your radar? I mean, obviously there's the Indiana connection, I guess, but was it James's listing, or, I mean, there were clearly other Negro League players that stood out that were in that list too.
Well, it was James's list. I mean, he's the best of all time and from the Negro Leagues in James's list. So that's something, and being from Indiana is definitely something for me. But the other thing that stood out was he clearly was a really interesting guy. And at first, when I started the project, I thought he was something very, very different than he turned out to be. Because if you just Google around and read what you can online, Wikipedia, and just random articles that have been written over the last generation, he comes off as maybe a sort of borderline psychopath, a violent man, kind of a berserker. And so I thought he was, that's what I thought I was going to encounter. That interested me. I thought, well, there must be some really good stories here. And it also interested me that there was a lot of contradictory information about him. Clearly, he hadn't been taken seriously as a historical figure. So that kind of is how I got interested in him. And as I say, I learned that he was somebody much different than I expected to meet in a good way.
Well, it's also interesting too, and I guess for our little genre of exploration on this show, it's also kind of a convenient excuse to kind of, revel in and all of the Negro Leagues generally, because, here's a guy, and maybe this is indicative of the Negro League lifestyle, played on, almost a dozen or so teams or variations of such across a number of leagues, which I think both speak to the relative, less than, shall we say, standardized consistency, I guess, of the quote unquote Negro Leagues, right? I mean, some of them were a little more league centric and well defined than others, right? And maybe you can give a little general background as to sort of why he was playing with Indianapolis for so many years and went through like, I don't know, it must have been 10 or 11 or 12 different teams over the course of his almost 30-year career.
Right. You hit on it. Probably the fundamental problem in the Negro Leagues in terms of their institutional structure was that they were chronically undercapitalized. There just wasn't enough money to make for stability. And so you had owners having to sell players off oftentimes. You had players just leaving teams because owners couldn't pay them or because they could get paid more over here. And league structures weren't strong enough to enforce any sort of discipline with respect to contracts and that sort of thing. Again, because the money wasn't there to make that possible. They couldn't afford essentially to enforce that kind of discipline. So what you have is a very fluid player movement. You have fluid sort of team movement in the sense of them coming and going. And that accounts for a lot of Oscar's career. It's not that he was particularly disloyal. He wasn't Satchel Paige, where he had no team spirit or no sense of sort of team cohesion. I mean, Satchel really had none of that, right? It wasn't one of the virtues he brought to the table.
Paige was the star attraction. He knew it, and most other people knew it too, right? Yeah.
Right. But he also had the sort of soul, the sort of solipsistic soul that he just didn't feel like any loyalty like to a team. Yeah, he knew he was a star attraction. Other guys did too. I mean, Oscar knew he's a star attraction for most of his career, but he generally didn't, leave to go play on a North Dakota auto dealers team in the middle of the season, like Paige did. So they were just different. They were very different personalities. But anyway, that accounts for a lot of it. Early in his career, he got into some contretemps with his managers. Only a couple of them. C.I. Taylor, his mentor, a man he ended up loving very much on the Indianapolis ABCs. They sometimes butted heads, but a lot of times it was just he was a victim of teams' financial fortunes. So that explains a lot why he and others moved from team to team. Another thing I'll just say quickly. Some of the teams he said to play for, like the Detroit Stars, that was only that'd be like for a few games in the season when he'd be loaned to play for them against like a team of white major leaguers, or some particularly big game. That's the sort of thing that also happened in the Negro Leagues a lot. And if you don't really delve into the history, you might think that he was like playing equally for this, 2 or 3 teams in a season, and that often or never was the case.
Yeah, well, so that's interesting. So maybe you can give our audience a bit of a sense of, I guess, more of the teams he was mostly prolific with versus, say, sort of the dalliances, say, the Stars Yeah, I know, certainly Indianapolis, the ABCs, certainly at the beginning of his career, certainly the Harrisburg Giants, I guess, arguably in the middle of his career, and Pittsburgh and the various Crawfords. Diaspora, I guess, after that. But maybe you can give our audience a sense of sort of, where most of his exploits kind of were rooted during his career, playing-wise.
Yeah, right. I would say those are the 3 main teams that he was associated with. The Indianapolis ABCs he came up with and played more or less, I think, like 6 of his first 8 seasons with them or something like that. Then he goes to Harrisburg in 1924 for 2 reasons. He's married a woman from Harrisburg, and she would like to be near her family. And secondly, he gets the opportunity to manage a team for the first time. He's 27 years old at the prime of his career, and is just a natural leader. He's not a natural follower. And the times he's most frustrated are when he's not in charge. So he's in charge of that team. He helps shape the roster. So he's with the Harrisburg Giants from 1924 through 1927 when they fold, essentially. He has to move again. And the Crawfords from 1932, really until that team folds after the 1940 season, I believe. So those are the 3 main teams. And then with the 2 other stints that would be worth really mentioning would be his couple of years with the Hilldale Club of basically Philadelphia, and the Homestead Grays in the other major Negro Leagues team in Pittsburgh. those would be the teams with whom he would be most closely associated.
Well, before we sort of get into sort of his hopscotching and I would call it guest starring, but going to other teams and stuff, maybe we could talk about sort of the origins of the career, because it also interesting too. It overlaps with, I guess, what the early days of this Indianapolis ABCs club was about, because like a lot of clubs in the teens and in the very early part of the 20s. They were mostly independent, right? Or I know certainly ABCs were, right? There were no, if you will, organized leagues per se. Obviously, a bunch that came shortly thereafter. But he spent a good amount of his time in the earliest part of his career playing with the ABCs and or independently. No.
Yes, right. The first formal Negro League isn't formed until 1920. So next year is the 100th anniversary of its formation. Before that, you just have, as you say, independent teams not playing in any leagues. And sort of like college football used to be, you do have sort of mythical championships that are awarded, often by themselves from teams, to themselves. But the press kind of gets involved before that time, kind of identifying who the best teams are. They're barnstorming across the country playing each other. And it sort of becomes clear. So yeah, that's what he's doing from 1915 when he debuts at the ABCs through 1919. And what that means is, as you point out, like in postseason play, he might hook up with a team from St. Louis to play some barnstorming players from the Tigers or something like that, or from the St. Louis Cardinals. And he might go to this team or that team very briefly just to get in on some action, basically to make some money. That's what baseball was like, not just before formal leagues are started, but even after the formal leagues are started. If an opportunity knocked, a player often would go take advantage of it. And oftentimes his owner would allow him to do that, especially if they could kind of split the cut. So that's part of the Negro Leagues story.
Yeah, it's almost like being sort of a rep for a concert sort of tour, right? You're a promoter, really. I mean, you're talking about gigs and stadiums and selling tickets and attracting as many people as you can, and then once it's done, get it ready and move on to the next town and do the same thing all over again. Yeah,
that's exactly right. So you might go to like Oscar, a couple of years goes to Florida after sort of baseball's over up north, and plays in something called the Hotel League in Palm Beach, where there were like two hotels that fielded teams of black players that played against one another. That's the first time Buck O'Neil saw Oscar Charleston play. Actually, it was in the Hotel League in Florida. Later in the 20s, he's going to Cuba almost every year to play winter ball. He goes to California one year in the winter and plays against white major leaguers out there. So yeah, there was always something going on. It makes for sort of a dizzying history. But at the time, what it felt like was just, what's the next opportunity down the road? Where can I go make some money applying my craft?
Well, give me a sense in these pre-league years with Charleston. In your research, like how does he start, or in your mind, when does he start to sort of get some notice, I guess, in maybe in the research and the clippings and the writings and stuff? Because obviously he emerges as one of the early players to make his mark in the leagues as they got formed, right? And we'll get to the Rube Foster, but was he standing out versus anybody else, or was he just a solid player that was just around and just naturally, like everybody else, kind of just gravitated to now a more semi-professional league once it got going? Or was he a standout? Was he becoming an attraction even in his independent days?
He stood out right away. He starts in 1915. He's only 18 years old, just out of the Army. He's been playing baseball in the Philippines. And he stands out. He shows a lot of power. And it was a time, this is the dead ball era when power was rare. So he hits like a couple of home runs in the first few games of his career. And it's, wow, that really blows people away. And he doesn't hit anymore the rest of the year, but he's still called, a powerful slugger for the rest of that year. And the other way he stood out was for his defense. He played a really shallow center field, and he went back on balls and made catches that people just could not believe. So that was the other way he stood out. And then there's a third way he stood out, and that was for getting into fights. he got into a spectacular fight on the field in an exhibition contest against a white team in 1915 in Indianapolis, in which he slugged an umpire, decked a white umpire at second base, who was fighting with one of Charleston's teammates at the time. And that caused an on-field riot of considerable scale, like front page news the next day in the Indianapolis Star, and it lands him in jail. He's bailed out by his owner, and they go to Cuba on a tour, and he ends up paying a fine, and that's pretty much it. But he makes a mark in some good ways and one bad way right away. And so by the time, then in 1918, I would say is his first really great year, hit something like 390 by the best statistics we have today. In 1919, when he's playing for Rube Foster in Chicago, this is right after World War I, he hits something like 400, and that's when he really becomes a superstar. It's say 1919, age 22. People are starting to talk about him as the greatest player in the black game. So that's about when that would happen.
Wow, I mean that's amazing, especially given the fact that the play was obviously not even quote unquote organized. I mean, it was not sort of within sort of league play, but maybe give a little bit of a sense. I mean, the fact that he was playing for the ABCs, which was already a notable franchise, perhaps along the lines maybe of folks like the Chicago American Giants, Rube Foster's team, right? It seems like around that sort of turn of the decade, those were kind of the two teams in this even pre-league kind of play that were kind of standing out already. I mean, it probably didn't hurt the fact that he was on one of those teams as a league was starting to get formed.
Yeah, it definitely didn't. Those were two of the bigger teams going at that time, although the ABCs actually didn't field the team in 1919, or at least didn't at the beginning of the season because of the war and some complications that arose from that. The East, you have a couple of big teams in the East, in New York, like the Lincoln Stars, I think at that time would have been a big team, or the Lincoln Giants. I may be mixing those up. So the names are so similar.
Hard to do mix all these teams up, right? Even the most scholarly of students have a tough time keeping up with all of it.
I know, I'm trying. I'll say this: when the league is formed, when Rube Foster, he gathers together all these prospective owners. He calls into a meeting in Kansas City, the YMCA that's still standing near the Negro Leagues Museum today, and he hands them all these articles of incorporation. I've started a league, and he's registered the corporation in all these different states, and they're very suspicious because Rube was ultra competitive, and they're like, "What's the angle?" And one of the ways he persuaded everybody that he was doing this for the greater good of black baseball was he gave Charleston back to the Indianapolis ABCs. We have to have competitive, some parity, right? And he gave him back. So that's Oscar sort of figures into the league's formation in that way. Not only was he probably the biggest superstar when the league had started, but Rube's great gesture of giving Oscar back to the ABCs was regarded as proof of his goodwill.
Well, but, right, I mean, Foster's also the guy behind the rise of the Chicago American Giants, right? And I'm guessing that, and now you correct me on this, right? So when Charleston goes to Harrisburg, known as the Giants, is there a relation there with the Chicago American Giants? Okay, that's just name only.
No, so many Negro Leagues teams were called the Giants.
Okay, got it.
It seems like nobody knows exactly why, but it became sort of code for this is probably a black team if you just read it in print.
Got it. So I was getting a sense of, okay, I was trying to figure out, to your point earlier, what was Foster's angle, right? Because clearly the American Giants was his baby. And, arguably I don't know how charitable he was trying to be by creating a league.
I think he was.
Okay.
I think he knew the league was going to raise all boats. I mean, he knew he was going to ultimately profit, and benefit from the formation of a league. But I think Rube was able occasionally to transcend narrow self-interest. And I think that was one of the occasions, in which he did that. I mean, there's a later occasion in which he loans money to the Olivia Taylor, who's C.I. Taylor's widow, who has come into possession of the ABCs and her finances are in terrible shape. And he loans her money to get through the rest of the season with the idea that she'll trade him Charleston after the season. Now, he's going to benefit from that arrangement, but at the same time, he knows, I can't just let this team collapse during the year. We got to have people to play. We have to have some stability. So Rube was always looking out for himself, but at the same time, he could take a big picture view.
All right, so how does Charleston get from a relatively, it seems, stable and standout kind of situation in Indianapolis and go to Harrisburg, which was independent in 22 and 23 and joins this, I guess, rival league or direct challenger to the Negro National League, the first one, the Eastern Colored League?
It comes back to what I was just saying. The ABCs were a financial mess, and Olivia Taylor had driven some players off, and there was all sorts of fights and tension. So that's the first thing. Like, Indianapolis was no longer a possibility. But the real reason, well, there are two other reasons. One, his wife was from Harrisburg, and she was a strong woman, very attractive, both physically and in her personality, from everything I could tell. And she, I think, played a big part in wanting to get back east near her family, to whom she was close. And third, he could manage at Harrisburg. He couldn't go back to Chicago manage. Rube Foster had that team. So I think all those factors coming together are what led him out to the, fairly small town of Harrisburg in this upstart league.
Well, all right, so let's talk about that, because this is, I'm guessing, the first time that he not only is a player, but also a manager, or is able to sort of straddle both of those roles for the first time. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And being a manager, at least at that time, and at least for Charleston, meant really putting together the roster. You're the general manager as much as you are a manager. The man who owned the team was a man named Colonel Struthers, who was like the second black policeman in Harrisburg, weighed something like 300 pounds, but taught ballet dancing to the youth of Harrisburg. He was quite a character. He wasn't necessarily so well connected in the world of Major Negro Leagues baseball to be able to put together a really good roster. That was Charleston's job, and that was something I think he really wanted to do. So,
give me a sense then of the Harrisburg experience, because I think this is also an important period of time in the Negro Leagues generally, right? Where, like a lot of things in this country, things kind of stumbled along as the Great Depression effectively took root, if you will, economically and macro, to the point where there was, from all indications, it seems like, the leagues that had sort of gotten sort of their start in the earlier part of the 20s were kind of crumbling and really kind of went dark after a while, after, say, 29 and 30. But this is during his time in Harrisburg, where he's arguably kind of, I want to say at the peak, but he's being able to do both things, right? And kind of stand out in both of those categories, both managing and playing.
Yeah, absolutely it is. It's definitely part of his peak. I mean, some of the statistics he puts up in Harrisburg are crazy. They were considered crazy at the time, and when in the sort of more exacting research is done in the last few years by people going back digging old box scores, they're still crazy. Like in 1924, he hits 405. 1925, it looks like he hit like 427. I mean, insane numbers. But Harrisburg, this is 24 and 25. This is before the Great Depression. His 4-year run there, the Eastern Colored League had probably its problems were not caused by like the incipient Great Depression. That was probably just more the usual endemic undercapitalization issues of the Negro Leagues. It's when he goes to Hilldale, and that's in 28 and 29. That's when the Depression starts to catch up with him. Another league folds in which Hilldale is playing, and that creates a lot of this, again, player movement like crazy. So he's only with Hilldale for a couple of years, and that's what the Depression and the folding of that team and that league pushes him out to Pittsburgh, where he spends the last sort of prime phase of his playing career, and ends up with a man named Cumberland Posey in his Homestead Grays.
All right. Well, I want to get to Posey in a minute, and Hilldale and Pittsburgh in particular in a second. But maybe this is a good opportunity to kind of maybe delve in a little bit into some of the numbers that he's putting up, both, on all parts, I guess, fielding, certainly in hitting. And maybe as you sort of answer or give our audience a sense of just how dominant and standout his stats and his play were. Can you square that, though, also with what I would imagine would be, a trust factor when it came to statistics in these leagues? Because, how believable, how credible, how not, or how reliable.
That's exactly the question. Yeah, that's exactly the question to ask. That's the question I asked, right? I mean, I want to know that too. I don't want to just rely on sort of mythical numbers. Unfortunately, we don't have to. So let me answer your question in a couple of ways. First question is, how good are Negro League statistics today? Can we trust them? And it's really odd, if you think about it, but the stats we have today are much, much better than we've ever had before, including at the time when teams were very lax about reporting stats, or leagues certainly were lax about collecting them oftentimes. And then, numbers would just sort of get made up in the press without too much to back them up. So what's happened, and this is just one of the great things that happened in sports in the last generation, certainly the last 10 or 15 years, really this army of volunteer researchers that have gone back. All these newspapers have been digitized. A lot of box scores were reported, and they've recompiled statistics from those box scores. And a site that I'd recommend, if any of your listeners are interested in this, the site called seamheads.com houses all of this. And it's really well done, and it only counts games against top competition. So this isn't just games against, the Little Sisters of the Poor. This is major Negro Leagues competition. It also includes games that these teams played against major league teams, as well as in like the Latin America as well. But so the stats are pretty good. To answer that first question, the quality, we don't have all of them, but the estimate I've gotten from people who really know this well, it's like we have 75 to 80% of the box scores between top teams. So it's a good representative sample. So the stats are pretty good. Sorry if you wanted to jump in there, but the second thing is, so we know that, and we know that Oscar right now, and they're still putting in new numbers from time to time on box scores you found. But right now, in about half the plate appearances that Willie Mays had, to give some context, he had 210 home runs, 355 stolen bases, hit 351, 431 on base, and a 575 slugging percentage. That's really good. And I've sort of played around sort of constructing like what would an alternative Major League Oscar truly been able to do. And it seems to me, like, if you just were very conservative and say, well, he would have hit at least 300 home runs. He would have stolen at least 400 bases. He almost did those, again, in half the plate appearances that Mays had. He was very durable. He would have hit at least 300. He hit 351 in the Negro Leagues. And we know he would have been like a positive defender, in the advanced analytics language. He would have been above zero in terms of defensive wins above replacement. Who else in Major League history has done that? Nobody. Nobody has hit those four marks. So that gives you some sense of how unique his skill set was.
All right, what's this? Mack Weldon. Mack Weldon, of course. Mack Weldon is the premium men's essentials brand that believes in smart design and premium fabrics. And, they go out on a limb, Mack Weldon does. They claim that their stuff is better than whatever you're wearing right now. That's pretty bold, and them's fighting words for sure. But you know what? In the case of Mack Weldon, it's absolutely true. Trust me, because I've been wearing a whole bunch of Mack Weldon stuff over the last number of months, and I can vouch for just about all of it, frankly. And they're designed, frankly, the Mack Weldon offerings to be the most comfortable underwear, undershirts, socks, shirts, hoodies, sweatpants, you name it. Anything in the realm of basics, Mack Weldon has got you covered. And not only does Mack Weldon's underwear and socks and shirts look good, they perform well too. They're great for working out or going to work or going out on dates, just everyday life. And I highly recommend them, and they're easy to purchase, and it's a great way to sort of get all your basics covered in one fell swoop with our friends at Mack Weldon. Of course, we got you covered with a discount for you. Make sure you use the promo code GOODSEATS when you go to MackWeldon.com, and you're going to get 20% off your first order. You bet, 20% off your first order just visiting MackWeldon.com and entering the promo code GOODSEATS. Now, beyond a couple of the shirts, and they've got a couple of great thermal long sleeve shirts. I love those, especially as the months are getting colder now. But I will tell you, probably the most underrated offerings in their collection of fine garb are socks. They've got a tremendous selection and array of different forms of socks. There's some really great dress and casual looking socks. They're high quality too. I've been wearing them, like I said, for a couple of months now. They stay high in your calf. They don't lose their shape. And of course, they're made with, along with a lot of their clothing that they've got at Mack Weldon, from their proprietary antimicrobial technology, which basically means they help eliminate odor. Doesn't mean you can't wash them. You got to wash them, of course, guys. But in terms of their staying power, shall we say, it's amazing technology that keeps your clothes as fresh and clean as they can be as they go on in their lifetimes. And again, we've got 20% off all of your purchases from your first order at MackWeldon.com when you enter the promo code GOODSEATS. So check it out. Again, MackWeldon.com, promo code GOODSEATS. And now, back to our conversation. In your research, and as you get a better sense of Charleston the player, what is your sense of the quality of play, say, relative to quote unquote organized baseball at the time? As good? Yeah. Not as good? Better? Depends?
It's a great question. So there are two things I'll say. One, with just respect to Oscar, we do have stats from 158 plate appearances he had against major league pitching, and his batting average is a little bit higher. His on base is just a tick lower, and his slugging is way higher. So he killed major league pitching too. But
I'm sorry,
and there's other things.
Before you go further on that one, are what exhibitions or situations where Major League and Negro Leagues were playing each other? And what were the dynamics behind those? Because I'm very ignorant about sort of those, shall we say, cross-pollination matches, games, series.
Well, this is something I didn't really realize, and probably a lot of people don't, but it was extremely common after the regular season was over for so-called organized ball, like you say, and for the Negro Leagues, for promoters to gin up a team of black all-stars and a team of white all-stars and put them against each other, either in just one city or as a sort of traveling show, right? A barnstorming show. So, and these are great players. This isn't marginal major leaguers we're talking about. We're talking about Lefty Grove and Walter Johnson and Jimmie Foxx and players like that, Lou Gehrig, whom Oscar himself played against. So those are the contests we're talking about. Usually in October, bleeding maybe even into November, is when those games would have taken place.
Interesting. Okay, so but then exhibitions. Back
to the quality of
no, but still, but obviously, we're not talking about watered down, quote unquote, white teams, right? These are head to heads, and so these stats, aside from
for the most part,
right? Okay, so clearly some standout then, and he makes
for the most part. Here's the thing: you have to. Two more things to really illuminate this. So we know that in those contests, black teams won the majority of the time. A little over 50%. I remember exactly what it is. Say it's 52, 53%. However, on the other side, if you look at how all black teams fared against teams at different levels, college teams, military teams, AAA teams, and all down the line, look at their winning percentages. Then you look at the winning percentages of white major league teams playing exhibition contests against those same levels, which also happened frequently in this era. The white teams have higher winning percentages in every category, not by a lot, but by a little. So what I would say in answer to your question is when you look at all the evidence, the white major league teams had more depth. Overall, the competition in the white major leagues, because of that fact, was a little bit better. Just from the top to the bottom of the roster, they were deeper than your average Negro Leagues team, which would have, say, the top 7 or 8 players, I would say, were major league quality. But you'd be filling out the roster with guys who would be probably in the minor leagues in so-called organized baseball. And that just makes sense when you think about it, right? There's just population differences here. There just aren't as many players for the Negro Leagues teams to select from. So that's the answer. The tops of the rosters were totally every bit as good. And the best teams could definitely have competed in the major leagues and comported themselves well. But overall, probably just a tick lower.
But and I know you've got a couple of examples in the book, and of course they elude me right this moment. But clearly he got some attention despite the segregated nature of baseball at the time from the white teams and white structure. No, about his play.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, it actually wasn't that uncommon for white. Let's say that Charleston would often play at Forbes Field. Even before he was in Pittsburgh, there would be a lot of games played at Forbes Field. It wasn't that uncommon for a Honus Wagner or a Paul Wainer or somebody like that to be in the stands watching. And these guys were interested. They wanted to see, how good these African American players were. And so that's where some of these observations come from later, and then even more come from guys who played against Oscar. And that's happening very early on in 1915, from the very beginning of his career, really until its end. And not just Oscar, but lots of other Negro Leagues players. So they see firsthand just how good he is and how good his peers are. And they're surprisingly not very shy, at least some of them, about reporting it, about saying, these guys are every bit as good as, what we have. And some of them say, one man in particular, I think it was Hollis Thurston, who hails down a former Negro Leagues player at one point, asked him if he played with Charleston. He says, yeah, he was my manager, actually. And Thurston, who had been a pitcher in the majors, said, I tell you, I barnstormed against him, and he was better than any other player I've ever played against. I'm counting Ruth, Cobb, Hornsby, and all of them. So, and he's not the only one to say that kind of thing. So, yeah, there was a lot of testimonials from white players based on what they saw.
Well, and ownership too. And maybe we can kind of, sort of speed up on one of the tracks here, because it'll become obvious in the 40s, right? And I want to come back to Hilldale and Pittsburgh in a second, but it didn't escape notice. And I guess what I'm really constantly curious about is during this era, let's say the 20s and 30s in particular, before integration and before, realities finally, broke through and kind of corrected some of the, in hindsight, it's just craziness of segregation. Mm-hmm. How what was the party line, I guess, versus the realities, right? Because it's clear that you're sort of hinting at, even in the book, right, that some of these players in the quote unquote organized major leagues are recognizing just how darn good these players are. Right. And not only what if, but how can we sort of, rectify and or harmonize this kind of stuff? Because the players are players, and baseball is a sport beyond arguably color.
That's a great question. I mean, and you when you phrase it that way, I realize probably more pointedly than I had when I wrote the book, just how much tension those testimonials probably created for the party line, which was in the 20s, at least in the 30s, that black players aren't as good. They're just not as prepared. Maybe they don't have the discipline to play at this level, whatever. I mean, that would be sort of the official racist party line. Then you have sort of backing that up some sort of consequentialist arguments, right? Like, well, the fans would never accept, whites and blacks playing together on the same team. So that's why we have to uphold this. Or, well, they might, but the Southern white players certainly wouldn't. And, and that's just an insuperable obstacle. So we'll just have to wait till things change in the South. So those would be sort of the more party line answers.
Well, I guess the financial instability of a lot of the leagues and the play and stuff too probably didn't help the cause either, because despite any great playing and all that kind of stuff and all these exhibitions, it just seemed like there was a litany of leagues and teams sort of coming and going and coming back and not a lot of stability.
Right. So for the very conditions that are responsible for segregation in organized baseball are also responsible for that sort of instability in the black game, right?
That too, right.
That's what, yeah. So, but it provides, you're right, a convenient excuse. Well, I mean, look, they can't even get their leagues really together. I mean, is this something we really need to take seriously? Yeah, you might hear some argument along those lines, which very ironic given the circumstances.
Well, all right, so let's get back to Charleston specifically. So give me a sense now, what is this Hilldale thing all about? Because that's even a smaller market than Harrisburg, I think, certainly by today's standards.
It's actually, It's Philadelphia. Hilldale is Philadelphia. It's Darby, Pennsylvania, which today is an inner ring suburb of Philadelphia. So why they weren't called Philadelphia, I have no idea. They never even got really a real nickname. Sometimes they were called the Daisies, but oftentimes they were just called the Hilldale Club. But they were essentially Philadelphia's black team until the Philadelphia Stars come along in the 1940s.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about that phase of his career, because not only there, but then also Pittsburgh seems like this is really where a lot of things started to kind of, really stand out for Charleston across a lot of different sort of people's radars.
Yeah, his signing in both places was celebrated as a major coup. Hilldale, that 1928 club, when he was there along with Martin Dihigo, who is this multi-talented kind of Shohei Ohtani / Babe Ruth of his time. He was a pitcher and hitter and was great at both. Were the leaders of that team and had great expectations, super high expectations. And Charleston was the manager. They got off to a slow start, and very impatient owner, a man named Ed Bolden, fired Charleston as a manager like a month into the season. And things sort of went south for the team. Charleston still put up a good season, but his days were numbered with them. He still gets through the 1929 season with them, but in 1930, when he has a chance, he bolts to the Homestead Grays in Pittsburgh.
Maybe this is a good example, though, perhaps, and another put a push pin on that. What of his personality, right? There are plenty of examples in the book of give our audience a sense of sort of what drove him beyond his play, because it seems like he had some interesting moments in time, and he wasn't, as you said earlier, not shy about standing up for himself or others or mixing it up, so to speak. Was it just a competitive streak? Was it a personal sort of thing in his background? What drove him, so to speak, in terms of personality?
It's a great question. So he was he had flares of temper, which he inherited, I think, pretty honestly from at least his mother, who once greeted a deputy on her doorstep with an axe. So she must have been given a flares of temper as well. But he was not an angry man. So he was intensely competitive on the field, but he was also really charming and charismatic and well-liked and popular and cheerful. So you have to keep both of these sort of poles together in your mind to understand who Charleston was. So to give you a great example, I think it was 1929, he's playing for Hilldale, and it gets to Homestead Grays, and the owner / manager, Cum Posey, comes out on the field to argue a call, and they get into a fight. Charleston gets into a fight Charleston slugs him in the jaw. Right. Well, by the end of that season, Posey has invited Charleston to come barnstorming with him and signs him for his team the next year. So he was the kind of guy who could hit you and you still liked. That's the best way I can put it with Charleston. He was, you wanted him on your side. And there was something just darn likable about the guy, even as he was just fanatically competitive on the baseball diamond.
Well, it also seems in the 30s, as he went to Pittsburgh and the Crawfords in particular, he also started to exhibit a flair not only for his play and his managerial talents, but also scouting. You can give us a sense of just how successful and standout the Crawfords were in the early 30s, because he was helpful in putting together arguably one of the best teams of either or set of baseball leagues in the early 30s.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the guy who starts the Pittsburgh Crawfords, at least puts them into the big time, is a Pittsburgh gangster named Gus Greenlee. And he wants a big time team, and he lures Charleston away from the Grays to come be the manager of the Crawfords. But again, it's Charleston's job to put together the roster. Now, they already had Satchel Paige, but Charleston helps convince Josh Gibson to come over from the Grays, and Cool Papa Bell comes on board, and Judy Johnson and Judd Wilson joined the team mid-year. Those are both future Hall of Famers. This team was bristling with talent, and continued to be so.
Even to the casual Negro League observer, that's a stellar lineup.
Yeah, and it was Charleston's job to whip them into a team and manage them and get Paige to show up for games on time and mentor Gibson and all the rest. So yeah, that gives you a sense of his leadership. A lot of the players on that team in oral interviews conducted later reflect back and say how tight they were as a team, how connected they were, and that Charleston had a big role in that. He was militaristic in the way he ran a team. He was as old school as they got. If you were on time, you were 10 minutes too late. But he also stood up for them and really helped bond them. Oftentimes in intense situations that would arise on the road. If they were barnstorming through the South, for instance, it wasn't unusual for there to be some sort of some tense moments with fans or something like that, or with cops for that matter. So he had a big part in making that Crawfords team what it was. And what it was one of the most celebrated Negro Leagues teams of all time.
Can you also describe for our audience, and I don't think we've kind of talked about this, is he obviously played in this thing called the East-West All-Star Game, which was kind of a big deal in Chicago's Comiskey Park for years. And he had a couple of great years around this time in that game too. So maybe you can give a little sense of how, what that was and why he was just a regular write-in for those games in the mid-30s.
Yeah, the East-West game was Gus Greenlee's idea. He was aping the first Major League All-Star game that had just gotten played. And he saw an opportunity to promote the game and make some money. And it became one of the most celebrated sort of social occasions on the calendar, actually, in the African-American community, especially in Chicago. But people came from all over to go to the game. And really a showcase for the leagues. And later on, a lot of white scouts show up at that game looking for talent. But Oscar was the leading vote getter in the first game, 1934, I believe, is what we're talking about now. So it speaks to his popularity that he was still, even at that time, very late in his career, the most popular player in the game. And later, he's often selected to be the manager of various teams in that game. And it's really probably no player probably received more cumulative votes, at least in the first few years, than Oscar did. And it was a showcase for him for sure.
So that didn't hurt, I guess, his popularity, not only in the Negro Leagues, but I guess also more broadly around baseball generally. But it just seems to me now, I know this is probably just too obvious, but it seems to me that as his career was starting to, elongate and wane, obviously you get older and your skills sort of can decline over time. But also the Crawfords themselves seem to kind of wobble as the 30s sort of wore on. I mean, was it almost just a kismet, or kismet, I don't know if it's the right word, a parallel that both he and the team were kind of sort of segueing, I guess, into a way and sort of him winding down his playing career to go more fully managerial by the end of the decade?
Well, yes and no. I mean, certainly Oscar's declining skills didn't help. And, by 1935, he really struggled with the first bad year since he was a rookie, had a good year in 1936, but that was pretty much it for him. But what really killed the Crawfords were Gus Greenlee's illegal street lottery empire crumbled. And so he had no money anymore. And he had to basically sell off Josh Gibson in a terrible trade. And then the other thing that killed them was Satchel Paige and a bunch of players jumping the team in 1937 to go play in the Dominican Republic for Rafael Trujillo, the dictator in the Dominican Republic, who lured them all with a pile of cash.
Yes, we want to get into that story at some point. A notorious team, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So those things are what killed the Crawfords just as much as Oscar's own deteriorating skills.
Well, it's interesting, too, because I think a lot of people, based on what I've read, and maybe your research either corroborates it or augments it or maybe even denigrates it a little bit. But, I mean, a lot of people look at the Crawfords team in, say, 35 as being one of the best ever in the Negro Leagues history. Yet, relatively soon thereafter, it kind of, falls apart.
Right, exactly. Yeah, really, you could pick the 1932 team actually sort of underachieved, but the 1933 and 1935 teams both won championships of a sort. The 1935 team won a very clear championship. And they were good again in 1936, very good again in 1936. But yeah, it all crumbles after that, never to come back. They end up going to Toledo, and Jesse Owens enters the story around that time as well.
Well, okay, so why don't we round third base then in that? Let's maybe make that illusion there. And I really want to get into his Charleston's managerial and scouting full-time job, and in particular, his relationship with one Branch Rickey, because it's clear that he's made some kind of impression, Charleston has, with perhaps the more influential owners in Major League Baseball at the time. But maybe you can kind of walk us through how that sort of all comes about.
I wish I knew how Rickey and Charleston first met. What I have is a little bit speculative. Rickey was managing the St. Louis Cardinals when Charleston was playing in postseason exhibition contests against them in the early 1920s. It's certainly possible that they met then. And Rickey has some things in his archives in the Library of Congress, like programs from Oscar Charleston managed teams even later after he was connected with him. So anyway, they had some sort of connection, and we don't know exactly how it came about. But we do know that in 1945, Rickey is in the midst of trying to find the first African-American players to sign with the Dodgers. And it's his plan to get a jump on the rest of the league and be ready to win when the war ends, right? But he has a problem. His scouts or him personally really can't go to a Negro Leagues contest without drawing attention to themselves and making it kind of clear what they might be doing, because there's a lot of agitation for integration at this point. So his solution to that problem is to hire Charleston to scout for him. And the cover for that is Charleston becomes the manager of a team called the Brooklyn Brown Dodgers, which plays in Ebbets Field in a new league called the United States League that Rickey gets involved with, probably just for this reason, to be able to scout black players more easily. So we know from the testimony of Rickey's lead scout, Clyde Sukeforth, that Charleston did a lot of scouting for the Dodgers in 1945. He backgrounded Roy Campanella for them. I convinced them that Campanella wasn't too old to sign. It was his real age. What he said was his real age. And he probably also scouted a number of the other early black players signed by the Dodgers. We have that, again, directly from Sukeforth. So, yeah, that was Charleston's scouting for organized baseball role. Probably the first African-American to be paid to scout for a major league team. He's never gotten credit for that, but I think that is the case.
So what if this United States League, it feels like almost an artificial / pretense for, I guess, what was effectively understood as going to be eventually an integrated approach to baseball, once the war was over, et cetera.
It was weird. It was Gus Greenlee's idea. It wasn't Rickey's idea. Greenlee wanted to get back into big time Negro Leagues baseball. I guess his finances had recovered, and he starts the United States League with a few other guys, and it's just meant to rival the two other major Negro Leagues, and Charleston comes on board to manage the team in Philadelphia. And that's sort of where things stand when Rickey gets wind of the league, probably from a Pittsburgh Courier journalist named Wendell Smith. And Rickey just sees an opportunity. It's like, oh, you're looking to put a team in New York? how about Ebbets Field? First of all, he can make some money doing that. But secondly, I think he just saw the opportunity. He was opportunistic on Rickey's part. And then he grandstands about it. He holds a press conference and says how the other leagues are big time rackets. This is going to be different. And, and maybe someday, kind of the thought was, maybe someday this league will go into organized baseball as a league, like as a minor league that's a feeder, just like any other minor league is to Major League Baseball. So that seems to have been sort of the thought behind the very short-lived United States League.
Yeah, and in this book, there's a couple of great pictures that you've got in the inset of Charleston in his Dodgers quote unquote uniform, as well as at the table with Branch Rickey and some other gentlemen in the process. And it almost feels like it's, maybe he's arguably maybe trying out for being a manager once integration sort of happens, maybe having a role. Albeit not as a player in an integrated sort of major league system.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if he had lived beyond 1954. I wonder if he would have at least become a coach, and maybe for Rickey, maybe with the Pirates at that point, back in Pittsburgh. That's entirely plausible that would have happened. He did manage an integrated baseball team. In 1942, 43, I think even into 1944, but it was a semi-pro team playing in the Philadelphia Industrial League. But he was very proud of that. He clipped a bunch of photos of that for his personal scrapbook. There were newspaper articles about it in the black press. And again, I wonder, did any other African-American manage even a semi-pro team that was integrated before 1942? I mean, it's not till the 1960s till it happens in organized baseball. So he may have been a pioneer there as well, but it tells you kind of how he was regarded that he could do that at the time.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple of last questions. So let's talk about sort of his waning years, because it almost feels to me like he was almost sort of an elder statesman at that point, having at least some credibility with the quote-unquote white establishment on managerial terms and scouting terms. Clearly, it didn't sort of net out into something more substantial in the majors after integration happened. But maybe a sense of sort of his later years, was he maybe up or in the midst of being considered for some other roles, or were his health issues or whatever? Were there other distractions that maybe prevented it, or was it just it just didn't happen for him for whatever reason?
Yeah, well, we don't know. And I'm trying to think of whether there'd even been a black coach by the time he died in 1954. I'm not sure there had. I'm trying to think. Like Buck O'Neill goes to the Cubs maybe around that time. But you're right. So he's
right
a manager.
Correcting us right now, but I'm sorry about that. Whatever.
Okay.
Our audience,
okay.
I'm sure they're saying they're correcting us as we speak here.
Great. No, he's managing the Philadelphia Stars after Jackie integrates baseball in 1947, a year in which Oscar's sort of out of the game. He's doing some umpiring. He gets back in the game in 1948, and from 1948 through 1952, he manages the Stars and says publicly and oftentimes, his goal is just to send up as many of these players as he can to the majors. Like everyone that goes up makes up a little bit for him, and the others of his generation who didn't get the chance. So he does play that sort of mentoring, coaching role. He's really calmed down by now, because remembered in really beloved terms by players who played under him during that time. And then in 1954, his last year in the game, he manages a team called the Indianapolis Clowns, which is essentially just a barnstorming team. Henry Aaron has played for the Clowns the year before. Unfortunately, they don't have anybody that good on the 1954 team, but he does win one last championship. The Clowns win the Negro American League championship. It's the last league standing. And so Charleston kind of gets to go out a winner. And soon after the season ends, he falls down a flight of stairs in his home, is diagnosed with cancer. He's paralyzed from the waist down and dies very soon thereafter.
Well, at least he had sort of that luxury at the end there. You wonder what would have happened. I mean, he died relatively young, right? He was in his late 50s.
Yeah, 57. Yeah, definitely. I mean, he could have had 20, 30 more years in him. Nature had taken a different course.
All right. Well, so what have you taken out of? You mentioned at the outset that you kind of had a sense of what Oscar Charleston was like and what was going to be, and you sort of got a sense of something quite different by the time this project was all sort of said and done. What, here's the sort of the softball, right? What is this sort of legacy? Because it took until 1976, for whatever reasons, to kind of, for the Veterans Committee to bring him into the Hall of Fame, right? So what happens in those decades in between, and what is the legacy now that, we're arguably baseball and sports and just culture is much more, shall we say, woke about, everything.
Right. Yeah. Well, he does. I mean, the truth, of course, he's sort of just falls back into obscurity after 1976. James, that ranking leads to a blip of interest, but not much. He sort of has stayed obscure, and for all the sorts of reasons I've mentioned. Hopefully that will start to end now, not just for him, but for others, especially of his generation and before in the Negro Leagues. His legacy, in particular, is it's clearly one of the greatest American athletes of all time. There's really no way to look at the evidence and not come to that conclusion. And I do think if it were better known, there might be even more agreement with the claim I make that he may have the greatest all-around complete resume of any figure in baseball history when you take into account not only the fact that he was maybe a top 5, top 10 player of all time, but he's also a great manager, voted the greatest manager in Negro Leagues history by a poll of ex-players, and was a pioneering scout, who broke the scouting color line. Man, that's a lot to put together into one. Babe Ruth has Babe Ruth on the field, but he doesn't really have anything after that, right? Just in terms of his baseball resume. So it's a very unique combination of achievements. And not only that, he was admirable. He was an admirable man. That's the thing that surprised me. I mean, I wasn't sure I would find that, but he's a leader. He really showed the toughness that it takes to make it under difficult conditions. And I think that's just it's a great lesson. It's a great life to read about and get to know because of the toughness he displayed and the sort of steadfastness he displayed under all sorts of, different conditions.
Amazing topic, amazing story, amazing history, amazing player / manager / scout. Oscar Charleston, arguably the most underrated or less than publicized standout in Negro Baseball League or arguably even baseball history. And I'm fascinated. I learned an amazing amount about this. And this book will really set you straight. And I, of course, recommend it highly for the holidays and thereafter. It's called Oscar Charleston, The Life and Legend of Baseball's Greatest Forgotten Player by our guest, of course, Jeremy Beer. It is available wherever good books are found. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. Buy it at your independent bookstore, or if you'd like a convenient link to it, just search up the episode number 143, holy mackerel, on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, and you'll be whisked away to Amazon to purchase that book, giving us a couple of nickels of love as you do so. And I think into the new year, we're going to also try to get an affiliate link with the independent bookstore world as well to give you an alternate choice. Clearly, independent bookstores are a very valuable thing in our nation and are frankly a dying breed. So whatever we can do to sort of help support them as well. But we will do that. Look for that in our linkage, shall we say, next year as we get into 2020. But our thanks to Jeremy for this fascinating conversation. And also, if you'd like to kind of celebrate a little bit of some of the Negro League stories and goodness as we get closer to 2020 and the 100th anniversary that you'll be hearing more about of the Negro Leagues, you go to our friends at oldschoolshirts.com and use the promo code GOODSEATS, get 10% off all of your purchases, including a whole host of very cool shirts devoted to some of the teams that we mentioned this week, including the Detroit Stars and the Chicago American Giants. Let's see. There are a couple of others in there. The Homestead Grays are represented with a cool-looking shirt. And there are a few others in there. But again, oldschoolshirts.com. I see the Pittsburgh Crawfords in there, of course. And again, the Indianapolis Clowns, a really cool logo shirt there as well. Again, all of those shirts and more can be found at oldschoolshirts.com, our great sponsors for a long time. Our pals P.F. Wilson and friends in Cincinnati. And again, use that promo code GOODSEATS to get 10% off all of your purchases. And obviously do it now for the holidays and get yourself a few things while you're at it as well. Let's see. We want to thank all of our great sponsors. And we, of course, want to encourage you to hang around on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Check out our social media feeds. You'll find us on Twitter at GoodSeatsStill. You will find us on Instagram at GoodSeatsStillAvailable. You will find us on Facebook. Just search us up there and you'll find a page devoted to us there. You can send us email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And of course, when you're on the website, you can also find the link for our weekly newsletter. If you want to be in the know, just send us a little, fill out the form there, and we'll get you on the mailing list. That's easily done, and we appreciate you're doing that too. And of course, we appreciate our friends at Podfly Productions who help put all of our production stuff together each and every week. And of course, the inimitable Dr. Jerry Payne, the good doctor, we call him, and we thank him, of course, and them for all their efforts each and every week. You want to find out more about Podfly, getting into the podcast game yourself, by all means, check them out at podfly.net. Tell them that your pal Tim sent you. And you'll be glad you did, as they say. All right, we are done for this week. We look forward to a very special year-end holiday episode next week. So until then, we send you on your way, and we appreciate you giving us a listen. And we wish you the best for the holiday season. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care, and we thank you for listening, as always. Bye-bye, everybody.